You guys so much for tuning back in. We are in the final part, I believe, should be, of the mental consciousness structure. And just like the last video, we're just going to jump right into it. No need to make these any longer than they usually are. So at the end, we talked about the sort of, no pun intended, logical endpoint of rationalism and the chaos it engenders. Now today, we're going to move on from that, even though bring it back in a little bit. So first he's talking about Christ, and he's talking about his interpretation of Christ and how Christ, of course, obviously has a religious sort of interpretation, but Gebser sees Christ as a bearer of the mental consciousness structure. He says, and it was Christ who was the actual bearer of consciousness, and thus empowered to lead the soul. Even today, those who act in his name, particularly the Catholic clergy, stress this essential and salutary hermeneutic aspect. For while the state numbers individuals, the church counts the numbers of souls. Christ is the first to be immune to the threat of resubmersion and regression into the depths of the soul or psyche, a regression again which Plato constructed the first mental network of philosophy. We'll talk about that at the end of this. Christ's immunity to resubmersion into the psyche is symbolically expressed by his survival of a shipwreck. But he was not carried by the sea onto land, as Odysseus had been delivered onto the shores of Phasis. Odysseus, upon awakening, found himself on the rescuing shore, and in this sentence every word is in its attendant place. Odysseus found himself awakening from sleep, from unconsciousness to consciousness, quote, on the rescuing shore, unquote, on the new brink where, literally, with firm ground under his feet, he could look back on the sea, the ever-wavering psyche. Only after this finding of himself, only after the sea, the great Heraclitean psyche had given him up, was he able to utter, still deeply moved himself, that word which moves us even today, am. This is huge. So if the mental consciousness structure was birthed from the discovery of space, and it is an objectified world, if we are objectifying something or pondering or considering an object, there must be a corresponding subject that can actually do the perceiving of the object. So the am, that's a sign of an ego, a psychological ego and a philosophical ego. The ability to perceive and to be aware you're perceiving. And of course, we'll get into this in a second, but there's going to be separation there. And that's, to a large extent, the beauty of rationality, though it can become a problem. When you go back and you read some of the books from 20,000 BC, or even all the way up until like 10,000 BC, there's not a ton of am. I am going to the market. I am going to find a lover. I'm going to fight this war. You don't see a ton of that. Instead, you see just sort of external. The mind is oriented externally rather than internally. Things are extroverted rather than introverted. He says Christ survives a shipwreck, however, and is able to walk on the water. With this deed, he overcomes the depths of chaos and is entitled to say not I am Christ, but I am the light of the world. With that declaration, the first wholly self-assured resplendence of mankind breaks forth, a resplendence venturing to state for the first time that it will assume the burden of the world's darkness and suffering. It is at this point where the paths of mankind, east and west, are to diverge. Although there is in India a mythological parallel of Christ's sovereign deed, one of the designations ascribed to Vishnu is Naravayana, or literally, he walks on water. So, I'm no Christian, but I think we've all heard the story of Jesus walking on water. Now, of course, the water was always an ancient and, I guess, primal or primordial symbol to represent the psyche, or the soul, if you insist, the internal state. So when one is lost at sea, one is lost in their psyche, in their self, in the soul. They are taking the deep, what did Joseph Campbell call it? The deep trek of the soul, the dark journey of the soul, or whatever it's called. So if the water represents the internal, the unconscious, again, the psyche or the soul, Jesus walks on top of it. If the water is the unconscious, Jesus walks on top of it, just like the ego is on top of whatever is below the threshold of unconscious, what we would call the subconscious or the unconscious. So Jesus was the bearer of consciousness, because not only was he resubmerged into the soul, remember the water, and of course the mythical conscious structure was birthed from the soul. So people can get lost in the water because there's not a strong sense of ego, there's not a strong sense of rationality, and because our emotions were so powerful, they sort of overwhelmed your ability to remove yourself from the complete energies of the internal state. Without the ego, without the sense of I, think Stoicism, think Marcus Aurelius, without that sort of, um, again, the ability to perceive and to be aware you're perceiving, you're far more likely to give into your emotional self, your negative, aggressive, and violent urges. Whereas the ego comes along. Now, of course, deficient rationalism will also keep the funeral homes in business, but we'll get there. And then, of course, Jesus also bears consciousness, and the am exists, which means an I. So we have both. We have the objectified world, and we have the ego, or the strong subject that can perceive the object. And as he's about to get into, this is a big change in the Western civilization and the Eastern civilizations. How they deal with the new sense of I, which in turn brings suffering, is a huge change. I'm sure some of you know where I'm going with this. Let's see, where do I want to go? The identical deed that prompts Christ to accept suffering via his conscious ego leads, in Buddhism, to the negation of suffering and to the dissolution of the ego, which, transformed, returns to the original state of immaterial nirvana. Excuse me. In Buddhism, the suspension of sorrow and the ego is held in esteem, and this suspension of sorrow and suffering is realized by turning away from the world. Nirvana, of course, meaning to blow out. Blow what out? The candle. What is that? The world. For Christianity, the goal is to accept the ego, and the acceptance of sorrow and suffering is to be achieved by loving the world. Thus, the perilous and difficult path along which the West must proceed is here prefigured, a course which it is following through untold hardship and misery. So I think this was a pretty big point. It's such a huge reason or attributing factor to the differences. Not the whole one, not all of it, but a big one is how the different civilizations reacted to the immersion of the I, the am, the strong self, the me. Now, of course, the West, we can't get out of the I, right? All we do is talk about ourselves. But in Buddhism, it's just as he said. So with the awakened ego, that brings with it, in turn, suffering, conscious suffering. Now, the West says, Christ says, accept this, accept the evils of the world with love. Buddhism, on the other hand, says turn away from it. They, like you just said, they want to dissolve the ego, but in doing so, they're kind of regressing back to this deficient magic. And I think it explains. I've never quite loved Buddhism just because it seems so nihilistic. And once I read that little paragraph, it all started to click. It is a turning away from the world. But in doing so, you remove all aspects of what a human is. It seems very nihilistic and very anti-humanist. But if you're interested in this, more power to you. Or if you want to prove me wrong, hey, email me. I thought that was a fascinating that Jesus himself, mythologically or in a real sense, was the bearer of consciousness. He was the one who said, "Hey, we're going to cause this new mutation, and I'm going to be here to do it." So a lot of people miss that. You don't really hear that much in Sunday school, I'd imagine. Let's see. Then he talks about. Okay, he says, but first we should address the question of the subject of consciousness as represented in the symbolic liberation from the bondage of the psyche in Christ walking on the water and its relation to specific sayings of Christ himself. It is not our intention to play the role of exegete and interpret various passages of the New Testament, but we would like to refer to a minor incident on the fringe, as it were, of canonical scripture recorded in the apocryphal passages ascribed to St. John and entitled St. John and the Partridge. In the scene where he rebukes a priest for being annoyed by a partridge running ahead of him, St. John demonstrates his sovereign knowledge of the soul. He says to the annoyed priest, "The partridge, you know, is your own soul." This clarity of insight and knowledge about projection, as we might express it in modern albeit inappropriate terms, bears witness to an extraordinary illumination of consciousness and distancing from the psyche. Here is a mental reality able to survey the mythical and psychic reality of symbols. So when these new consciousness structures appear, they give you new tools or new glasses to use to help understand the preceding consciousness structures. And the partridge, is your own soul. One, we have own soul. That's clearly communicating a sense of individuality. You didn't see a ton of that before that. Two, again, the ego is now separated from the psychological energy, and with work, it is no longer a slave to it. It can now create separation from you. The ego can say, I am angry right now, instead of just simply giving into anger. I have separation from the inner workings of my body to an extent, or the external world, and the ability to perceive and to be aware you're perceiving, which is what is growing. I can sort of retreat into this world and say, this is just anger. I shouldn't do this. Every time I get mad, it always blows back times 10 or whatever. Or you say, yeah, I am going to kill this guy, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is there's a separation there, a sense of I goes. And then, of course, this is the beginning of the psyche, right? So this is, so now we're starting to see, the first, I guess, classifications of things like projection. Maybe not in those words, that wouldn't come till Freud, but you're starting to see a difference in the way objects in the world are brought into relation with each other. All right, let's see. Later on, he says, is there anything else? All right. He says, during the centuries following Plutarch, which were marked by the increasing strengthening of Christianity in the wake of the persecutions, Christianity was forced to defend itself against the last great magic mythical incursion inundating Rome from the east, as well as against the syncretistic assimilation of deficient mythical and mystical residua. Once again, the mental structure detaches itself from the mythical. The result is the new interpretation of the word religion that became current in the age of the church fathers. Is big. From here on, the word is given an arbitrarily mentalized etymology based on the verb relegare, or religere, to tie back, constrain. This change reflects the growth of Christian man out of the polar mythical structure characterized by careful observance, or religere. Okay. With the new consciousness structure, because it's such a seismic change, now we're even redefining religion, which of course back then was everything. We view it as nothing. It's nothing in Western America. But back then it was your whole life. I mean, you would die for it. Originally, what that meant is careful observance of God's teachings, of God's will, yada, yada, yada. Now, it says to tie back or constrain. Those are two completely separate ideas. Why is that? Let's see. The capability for such careful observance becomes vestigial because the structure demanding it is no longer dominant. Perfectly said. Perfectly said. Religere is supplanted by religare. The attempt of the church for the next 2,000 years to constrain man, or at least his soul, to the archaic magic mythical zones which he has for the most part mentally outgrown. Here the demand of faith is created and placed into dualistic opposition to knowledge. This actually I'm going to stop there. Big point. The mental consciousness structure, the new way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other in its efficient form, is deconstructing the previous way, which is deficient, mythical, magical. It says that's all irrational nonsense. So the new definition of religion is to tie back your rationalist urges, to deconstruct the religion, and to keep it in here with the soul, to make sure that rationality does not encroach in areas where it doesn't belong. But of course, originally, as he just said, it meant careful observance. There was no threat of logical deconstruction of my mythology. So there's no real problem. And then, of course, the new mental rational people are, like I think I said this in my last video, but now they're placing, we have knowledge on one hand, or we have faith. These are negations. One is knowledge, and one is an irrational belief in your feelings. If you watched my last video, that is nonsense. Everything depends on how you want to define faith. That's a ridiculous definition. This religio is the sole attempt to maintain a tradition which was to have duration in the West, and it survived in all probability because the magic element, the element of might, was perhaps too strongly maintained by the Church even to the point of bloodshed in its struggle against all other traditional communities. Yet this concern for the constraining bond had its legitimacy, as we can see if we recall that the measuring and experiencing of the psyche that create a distantiation from it are accompanied by a growing knowledge of its nature. When all knowledge is ever in danger of being forgotten, and all distanciations is imperiled by the ever-present possibility of isolation. Today, many people have forgotten their heritage, if indeed they have not lost it altogether. This is fascinating. So he's saying, this is why I've almost come around to religion, even though I don't belong to one. Even though it can be irrational nonsense. Nonetheless, it seems necessary. It is a tieback to an aspect of the human condition that will never go away, that other aspects of the human condition have been created by it, and we need to keep that, we need to respect that. We can't just have the rational bully all the other aspects and pretend that everything's going to work out. It's not. It never will. As Peter Sloterdijk reminds us, religion is more a cultural immune system. When the civilization gets sick, it is supposed to protect us from the realities of the real. So we have famine, the death of children in childbirth or outside of it, war, genocide, assaults, torture, all sorts of terrible things, natural disasters. And it's supposed to protect us from incursions against hostile ideologies. So I guess like the woke left, there's a reason why they caught such fertile ground that we were completely defenseless. And then you have other things like just sort of any radical extremist, terrorist, or religion, or one that wants to punish you because you're not of the right race or the right ethnicity or any of that stuff. That's what religion is supposed to do. Of course, while also imparting meaning, purpose, wisdom, and binding the outer tribe. Of course, there are problems with it. Again, I'm not a religious person, but Gebser, I think he's making the point here that we can't just pretend these aspects don't exist. I know the rational people or the rationalists would love for myth, symbol, rationality, religion, theology. I know they would love for it to simply disappear, but it never will. I would love for cancer to not exist. It does. I would love for gravity, I guess to a certain extent, not to exist. It does. So I'm not going to go throw myself off a 100-foot building. Very simple. You just have to deal with the world how it is. And if you're a rationalist, you should be so smart that you can do that easily. Sorry, that was my one shot. All right, what else? Then he gets into some more church stuff, which is interesting. Let's see. Then he says, now he at one point, I didn't originally plan on talking about this, but it's interesting. He says, but the most imposing arc is it perhaps the link from a beginning to an end spans the distance between Zeno and Einstein, between the first design of relativity and its realization in our day. So again, this is not just philosophy. Gebser is saying the rational mental consciousness structure expresses itself and manifests itself in all forms of human expression. It is not just philosophy. It is philosophy, art, architecture, English, poetry, math, science, anything, whatever you want to think of. All right, later on he says, we noted it earlier, a deficient form within the magic structure analogous to this rational phase of the mental structure. Spellcasting still retains the character of moderation, while witchcraft or sorcery is immoderate and unmeasured. Just as spellcasting directs nature, and man's organic nature consists, after all, of directed organic functions justly able to support the spellcaster out of his own substance, so too menace directs menos, or thinking. And just as sorcery in immoderation oversteps the established limits of mere spellbinding, employing extraneous means and foreign substances to attain its ends, the ratio immoderately oversteps the bounds of measured direction and moderation which menace and menace have established. Rationing, that is, dividing and dissecting everything and using extrinsic and extraneous substances to attain its purpose. So, talked about this a little in the last video, but we start dividing and sectoring to the point where not only are we conferring obscurity, but we're conferring chaos and things that become immoderated. Now we are no longer guiding rationality. Now rationality is guiding you, me, I, us. That's a problem. And then he hasn't gotten into it yet, but once you get so lost in the abstract and you're trying to reconcile, it's like he said, you're just pulling whatever you can. What happens is the psyche wiggles its way back in, and then reinterprets things. So you think you're emotionally detached, but in reality, you're a slave to your psyche. Very active setting aims or purposes emphasizes the negative effect of these two deficient forms of the magic and mental structures. Every set purpose is always charged with might and is, moreover, emphatically self-serving. Thus, it is the very antithesis of the wholeness of the world. Here we can discern the reason that both of these deficient forms, witchcraft, ratiocination, or intellectualizing, which substitute ritual or organization for the organic processes, can be regarded as demonic forces. The connection is already evident in the root of the Greek word daimon, da, which is in its Sanskrit form in the word deity, D-E-A-Y-A-T-E, means he divides or severs. The cognate Greek verb diomai means in fact not merely to divide, but to split apart, dissect, tear, asunder, mangle. Notice all the synonyms there, or all the different meanings. Back then, there was no one definition for a word. But he says it, not me. Demonic, my friend. The rationalists are demonic. They destroy and they tear down everything good. When taken too far, though, of course, they don't realize this. I'm not trying to say all these guys are necessarily have malicious intentions, but it's a problem. Let's see. The degree of slackness or tautness of the bonds between the psyche and the mind depend on the intensity of the mind. As long as the mind moderates and directs the psyche is to a certain extent dependent on it. But whenever the mind is in its intellectualized form, loses its moderating ability, and is dispersed without direction, the relationship is reversed. The negative aspect of the psyche imperceptibly gains dominance over the rational. Because the potentiality of the mental world grew out of the mythical world with its psychic emphasis, it necessarily evidences the dual aspect of everything psychic as a latency within itself, if only in the diminished and mentalized form of duality. It's just what I said. And when you get too lost, you are not reaching some neutral, completely, wholly unbiased truth. The psyche worms its way back in, and he says, depends on the degree of slackness or tautness of the bonds between the psyche and the mind depends on the intensity of the mind. As long as the mind moderates and directs the psyche is to a certain extent dependent upon it. Think Stoicism. Stoicism privileges the self, so you can enact a sort of quick fire CBT, a cognitive behavioral therapy. So you can discriminate amongst your emotions and keep your mind in its place and do the right thing and only focus on what's in your control, yada, yada, yada. It confers a real psychic unity, and there's a reason people love it so much. And at its best, it can be, life-saving, really, whether you're depressed or you're doing bad things, and it can change your life. It's a beautiful thing that the ego can do. But when it becomes a moderated, of course, that's the problem. He says, perspective fixes the observer as well as the observed. It fixes man on the one hand and the world on the other. Compelled to emphasize his ego ever more strongly because of the isolating fixity, man faces the world in hostile confrontation. The world, in turn, reinforces this confrontation by taking on an ever-increasing spatial volume or extent, as in the discovery of America, which the growing strength of the ego attempts to conquer. The strengthening of the ego is revealed in the sense of self-importance manifested by the condottiere, the Renaissance man, as well as in the many diaries which were then very much in vogue. So the more rational we are, the more we rely on rationality, the more our ego rises. And then, of course, the more it rises, the more likely it is to be immoderate. And now we got problems. This dualistic opposition of contraries, whose positive aspect is the concretion of man as well as of space, includes at the same time the negative component recognizable in the fixity and sectorization. The fixity led to isolation, the sectorization to amassment. These developments are the conclusion of a process in our day, that was already prefigured as a negative possibility in the very, very beginning of the mental structure. Its roots can be traced to the inadequacy of the synthesis of duality, and inadequacy manifests in abstraction and quantification. So we posit the one thing that's quantifiably measurable in conscious zone, posit the other, and then invoke the third aspect of measuring thought, this rational reconciliation. As you can probably tell, it does not hold a candle to the unity conferred by the mythical structure and the magical structure. The mythical structure, yes, it had the poles and the I guess the binaries, but they weren't dualistic. They were polar, and they existed on their own. They didn't need us to come in here and rationally reconcile them. Unity didn't even have that. Everything was just one. So that's like very, very unified. So that's the big problem. Let's see. As long as the moderating quality of the mental consciousness was still effective, abstraction and quantification were only latently capable of negative effects. But when moderation was displaced by the immoderation of the ratio, a change most clearly evident in Descartes, abstraction began to transform itself into its extreme form of manifestation, best defined by the concept of isolation. While the identical process led from quantification to amassment and agglomeration. Agglomeration, excuse me, that was stupid. So Descartes, of course, what does he do? Number one, he comes up with the XYZ Cartesian phase space, which is big for math and even philosophy to an extent. But what he also did was I don't want to say the first skeptic, but what he did was he tried to build up a philosophy of self and the world from the ground up using rational thought. And what he did was he was a complete skeptic of absolutely everything, even the idea if everyone else is an alien, playing a trick on you, playing some Truman Show game on you, everything. There's no God, there's no nothing. And what he realized is that, well, the world must exist, or I must exist. How do I know I exist? I don't trust my senses. I don't trust these people. I don't trust God. I don't trust anything. Well, I know I exist because in doing all this, I'm thinking. It's kind of hard to do this without thought. If I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. So I know I exist because I can think. I think he might touch on it. But notice we're shifting the life-giving principle from, I don't know, the heart or the body into the mind. This is the mental consciousness structure. Now, of course, with Descartes, it switches from rationality to rationalism. So this is the beginning of needless rational skepticism that is wholly divorced from reality and does absolutely nothing. I believe, as he just called it, philosophical pseudo-intellectual nonsense, or whatever he said. We don't need to do this. You don't need to needlessly divide your psyche just to prove how smart you are. It's stupid. It's a waste of time. Again, it's just going to lead to chaos, and your psyche, all your biases are going to worm their way back in. Trust me. We don't need to do this. So he identifies Descartes as the one who, after that, we need to stop with this rationalism nonsense. These consequences of the perspectivization of the world evident in the isolation and mass phenomena of our day are patently characteristic of our time. Isolation is visible everywhere. Isolation of individuals, of entire nations and continents. Isolation in the physical realm in the form of tuberculosis, in the political in the form of ideological or monopolistic dictatorship, in everyday life in the form of immoderate busy activity devoid of any sense direction or relationship to the world as a whole, isolation in thinking in the form of the deceptive dazzle of premature judgments or hypertrophied abstraction devoid of any connection with the world. And it is the same with mass phenomena, overproduction, inflation, the proliferation of political parties, rampant technology, atomization in all forms. So the isolating fixity, the ego, the separation that the ego draws, that leads to isolation. And he just listed off all the problems, beautifully said. I almost don't even want to say anything else. And then, so we have measure, and they're isolated, but now we amalgamate. Oh God. Now it's mass. Now it's time to multiply everything and keep sectoring and keep creating more. So on one hand, there's more of everything, but everyone is more isolated from the world. And he just described it beautifully. All of these consequences are sufficiently obvious as to absolve us from the effort of adducing further examples. Yet it is eminently worthwhile to inquire as to what sustained or reinforced the development over the past 4 centuries which led to these results, and to this we have indirectly furnished an answer. It can be found in the notion of technology that brought about the age of the machine with the aid of perspectival technical drafting, and the notion of progress that spawned the age of progress, and in the radical rationalism that, as we are surely justified in saying, summoned the age of the world wars. He says some readers may be dismayed that we have placed immoderation into the context of ratio or rationality. Those would be rationalists he's talking about. But ratio must not be interpreted in a perspectivistic sense as understanding or common sense. Ratio implies calculation and, in particular, division, an aspect expressed by the concept of rational numbers, which is used to designate fractions and decimals, i.e. divided whole numbers or parts of a whole. This dividing aspect inherent in ratio and rationalism, an aspect which has come to be the only valid one, is consistently overlooked, although it is of decisive importance to an assessment of our epoch. Again, why do we use rational numbers 1, 2, 3 through 10 or 9 instead of Roman numerals, Arabic numerals, Greek numerals? Because they can be divided. Now, it's not just 1 to 2 to 3, it's 1 to 1.1 to 1.2 to 1.3, and of course you can keep going until infinity. The divisive propensity is inherent in rational thought, the ratio. We see it in rational numbers. Remember, rationality takes the whole of any situation and divides apart from the whole that which is quantifiably measurable and consciously known, and then does its thing. So when you are way too lost up here and your psyche has been atomized, I believe, that's not good. That's going to be a problem. Now we're going to have nihilism. Now we're going to have extreme skepticism. Now you're going to go pick up a gun. Now you're going to go pick up a needle. Don't do that. You don't need to keep dividing and sectoring everything. There is a limit. Just put aside rationality for a second and come back to the real world. Be a real human. All right. Let's see what else we got. Is that it? Here's a good one. These positive qualities of the mind, able to convey illuminative insight into the world, are still effectual today, although it would seem that they are distinctly diminished in strength in proportion to the effectivity of the rational. Only the very few summon the courage to speak their own mind and not the rationally circumscribed and mass-produced attitude or viewpoint against philosophical authorities or popular opinion. It is easy to speak one's own mind only after the particular opinion has become common currency. Don't let the rationalists walk around like they've got it all figured out. Please grab some balls, recognize you're going to die one day, and say none of this is going to matter in about 100 years. I'm going to stand up for what I think is right, and if you can prove me wrong, then I will go with you. We don't need to be weak and let these people walk around and ruin society. We have to have the courage to stand up against common opinion if that common opinion sucks. Rationalism sucks. So find courage. Let's see. All right, now we're going to read just the last bit. It might be a little bit, and then we'll be done with the mental structure. With reference to the subject of this section, we should like to discuss in conclusion the three most familiar definitions or statements on thought and thinking. The first, that of Parmenides, mentioned above, would seem in philosophical... excuse me. The first, that of Parmenides mentioned above, would seem in philosophical terms to inaugurate the mental consciousness structure. We refer to his sentence, for thinking and being as one and the same. So think about how important thought is, the value now placed on thought. Now it is responsible for ontology. Before it wasn't even really around, and myth and magic and all that stuff. But now thought is being. Again, that with Descartes, I think therefore I am, you can see these changes. Let's see. The statement equates giving moderation and balance. The other two definitions, which may be considered to initiate the rational phase of mental consciousness, are quite different. The one is by Hobbes and reads, thinking is calculation in words. The measuring aspect of thinking, its quality, has been changed to a quantity via the pluralizing inherent in the statement as well by the numeral calculation. The third statement by Descartes is cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Here the isolated thinking by an individual is alone valid, and the spatial being of Parmenides comes to be identified as a consequence of thinking with the being of a person. What takes place here is typical of all quote-unquote thought processes, that result in extreme abstraction. They denature and invert the genuine interdependencies. The inceptual am of Odysseus becomes a result of a faculty of the ego, an ego with the faculty of thinking in addition to its vital and psychic capabilities. Now, this is where we get to a great example of how, when getting lost in abstraction, the psyche worms its way back in. Now, such statements such as this axiom of Descartes are amenable to various interpretations, as demonstrated by the interpretation of Bertrand Russell, which is partly in contradiction to our own. In Russell's view, Descartes' statement is evidence that the mind is more certain than matter. But if we take into account, as Russell does, that cogito for Descartes includes also the meaning of one who doubts, understands, conceives, affirms, denies, wills, imagines, and feels, we still do not eliminate the problem of ambiguity. But if we compare Descartes' axiom with Augustine's query in his Soliloquia, you who wish to know, do you know that you are? I know it not. We can see that the Cartesian disassociation that we spoke of above is not yet crucial for Augustine. We should also bear in mind that Descartes' sentence represents a reply to Gassendi's ambulo, ergo sum, this I walk about, therefore I am, that's what I was talking about earlier, is an expression of the manifestation of the ego or I, whose consciousness rests primarily in action or deed. Descartes, with this premise of cogito, transposes the action or movement confirming or substantiating the existence of the ego essentially from the psychic vital realm into the psychic mental, and this is merely a kind of hypergradation that does not eliminate the ergo. I'm getting a little abstract here. We have deliberately selected Russell's commentary from the many similar individualistic interpretations of Descartes' axiom. The fact that such varied interpretations are possible at all and remain at variance even if we take into account the particular definitions of each individual philosopher, can be explained if we remember that all such axioms are in part determined by the psyche. Repeat for emphasis. The fact that such varied interpretations are possible at all and remain at variance even if we take into account the particular definitions of each individual philosopher can be explained if we remember that all such axioms are in part determined by the psyche. So Descartes is rationalistic, according to Gebser. We're too lost in the abstract, we're needlessly divisive, and this will confer chaos. I think, therefore I am. Okay, got it. Figured it out. We have Descartes and Gebser's interpretation of that, and then he says, in Russell's view, Descartes' statement is evidence that the mind is more certain than matter. Bertrand Russell, I might later on try to figure this out. Even to this day, I still don't quite. I don't think he explains Russell's interpretation particularly well here. But he says, look, I got interpretation A. Bertrand Russell has interpretation Z. We're both talking about the same thing. We both agree on the definitions, and yet, in theory, we should be removing ourselves from the biases of the psyche, which create what? What is a bias at the end of the day? The creation of a distorted reality. Because we're an abstract, neutral, logical thought, and so we're in rationalism, so we're too abstract. What happens? We have Gebser's interpretation, we have Russell's interpretation. These are contradictory interpretations according to Gebser. The fact that there are different interpretations at all, that tells me we have not reached some definitive truth, like 2 plus 2 is 4, or the whole is always greater than the part. No, you got lost in the clouds, and because even though you're working with the same idea, you have the same definitions, we have two contradictory interpretations. What does that tell you? The psyche of one and the psyche of the other are steering the ship. It would not make sense that if it weren't the case, they would agree, because again, we're supposed to be removing ourselves from distorted realities, but we haven't. Instead, we've just gotten lost in the clouds, and now our ability to rationalize and reason and engage a rational thought has been corrupted by the psyche. So that is the problem, and there are always more examples of this. Maybe I'll do a video on that. That's big. Let's see. Here we can discern the tragic aspect of the deficient mental structure. And there will be further instances. Reason, reversing itself metabolistically to an exaggerated rationalism, becomes a kind of inferior plaything of the psyche, neither noticing nor even suspecting the connection. Although the convinced rationalist will be unwilling to admit it, there is after all the rational distorted image of the speculatio anime, the speculatio rationis, a kind of shadow boxing before a mirror whose reflection occurs against the blind surface. This negative link to the psyche, usurping the place of the genuine mental relation, destroys the very thing achieved by the authentic relation, the ability to gain insight into the psyche. So once you get too lost in the abstract, once the psyche turns the ability to ration into an inferior plaything, as he says, now you've just removed yourself. Now there's no real separation. from ego and psyche, and now you have no way to gain insights into your own psyche. How can you gain insights into your own psyche when your psyche is controlling you? In order to gain insights, you must create separation, and that can only be done by a moderated, healthy ego. When we get too lost in the ego, you have re-submerged yourself in the psyche, and now you have no way to get insights. Well done. You are the fish in the water who doesn't even know there's water, and the ego is trying to take you out so you can have insight into the water, but you've been taken out, and then you forgot what it was like to be taken out, and then they threw you back in, and now you're just confused. Here's the last paragraph. In every extreme rationalization, there is not just a violation of the psyche by the ratio, that is, a negatively magic element, but also the grave danger, graver because of its avenging and incalculable nature, the violation of the ratio by the psyche, where both become deficient. The authentic relation to the psyche, the mental, is perverted into its opposite, to the disadvantage of the ego that has become blind through isolation. In such an instance, man has become isolated and his basic ties have been cut. The moderating, measuring bond of menace and menos is severed. Cut, severed. What was again the meaning of the root da? It is this cut off, sever, divided, the demonic. The gates to the demonic forces, quote unquote, have been opened. Nothing exists out of itself. Everything follows upon something else. Everything has become a consequence. We may well ask, a consequence leading to what? So that was the last paragraph in the mental structure. He says, let me try to reread that for a second. Authentic relation to the psyche, the mental, is perverted into its opposite. So yes, that is the mental consciousness structure, and those are some of the good aspects to it, some of the bad aspects to it. Lord knows, God, probably 2.5 hours almost on this one section. I'm kind of blown away. It's a really important thing. Obviously, it's an aspect of you, just like all these structures. And soon enough, we will be on to the integral structure. So please, I cannot wait to see you guys then. And thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are the best. Also, I just, a couple weeks ago, I did an interview with John David Ebert, and he released that interview today. So please go look up John David Ebert's channel. He's the one who put me on to Gebser. He's the one who put me onto all these crazy thinkers. And I think we had a pretty good interview. I was able to interview. We got to talk Gebser. We got to talk Cormac McCarthy. We got to talk a bunch of stuff. So thank you, John. You are the fucking man. Oh, I shouldn't swear. You are the man. And please go check out his channel and go buy his courses at the John David Ebert School of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. It's a great stuff. He has great online classes that he will email you. He will send them to you. Just send it to his PayPal, not Teachable. Don't send it to Teachable because they take a huge cut. Just email him at johndavidebert@gmail.com. Just say, hey, I got $150. I'll buy one of your courses. There you go. Thank you guys so much. And again, we'll be moving on to the integral structure next. Now, I want to warn you, he doesn't say too much about it, if only because that's what the whole second half, or the second book of this book, the second volume, I should say, is about. So I will see you guys then, and I am so excited. Be safe, all right?